Chapter 19. Storm. Beetle was not sitting in the most comfortable position in which to ride a dragon. He was behind the wings and on the downward slope toward the tail, which meant that because Spitfire used his tail to control his flight, Beetle found himself moving up and down like a yo-yo. He was, however, tightly wedged between two very tall spines, and kept telling himself that there was no way he could fall off. He did not find himself totally convinced. After Spitfire had taken off, Beetle had twisted around and looked back past Spitfire's massive tail, watching the boats in the harbors grow ever smaller, until they looked no bigger than tiny toys. Then he had concentrated on the twinkling lights of the trading posts, strung like a necklace along the shore. Beetle had watched them grow ever dimmer, and when the night finally closed in behind them, and the last faint glimmer disappeared, a feeling of dread had crept over him. He shivered and pulled his heat cloak closer, but Beetle knew he was not cold. He was scared. Being scared was not something that had happened to Beetle before, as far as he could remember. He had had moments in the ice tunnels, especially during his first few trips, when he had been a bit uneasy, and he had not felt too great in the frozen forest on the way to the House of Forks either, but he didn't think he had ever felt the feeling of dread that he was now sitting like a fat snake curled up in the pit of his stomach. Spitfire flew steadily on. Hours passed, which felt like years to Beetle, but his fear did not subside. Beetle now realized why he felt so bad. He had ridden Spitfire before with Septimus on illicit trips out to the farmlands, and once even up to Bleak Creek, which had been extremely creepy. He had even sat exactly where he was sitting now, when they had all flown from the House of Forks to the trading post, but he had always flown low, and had been able to see the land beneath. Now, in the dark and high up over the sea, the great emptiness all around them overwhelmed him, and made him feel as though his life were hanging by a thread. It didn't help that it was becoming increasingly windy, and when a great gust of wind suddenly caught Spitfire and sent him wheeling sideways, the snake in Beetle's stomach curled up a little tighter. Beetle decided to stop looking out at the night and focus instead on Septimus and Jenna, but he could only see Jenna, and not much of her. She too was wrapped in a heat cloak, and the only clue as to who was actually inside it was an occasional long tendril of hair escaping in the wind. Septimus was out of sight, down in the dip of the dragon's neck, and hidden by the broad pilot spine. Beetle felt weirdly alone. He would not have been surprised to suddenly find that he was the only one riding Spitfire. Septimus, however, was fine. Spitfire was flying well, and even the gusts of wind, which were getting stronger and more frequent, did not seem to bother the dragon. True, Septimus wondered if he could hear distant thunder, but he told himself that it was probably the noise of Spitfire's wings. Even when a sudden squall of freezing rain hit them, Septimus was not too concerned. It was cold, and it stung when it briefly turned to hail, but Spitfire flew through it. But it was the sudden crack of lightning that shocked him. With the sound of a million ripping sheets, the lightning snaked out of the clouds in front of them. For a split second, caught in the flash, Spitfire shone a brilliant green, his wings transparent red with a tracery of black bones, and his riders' faces a ghastly white. Head up, nostrils flaring, Spitfire reeled back from the flash. For a terrifying moment, Beetle felt himself slipping backward. He grabbed hold of the spine in front and pulled himself back, as Spitfire righted himself, put his head down, and continued on. Some of Septimus's confidence began to ebb away. He could now hear a constant rumble of thunder, and ahead he could see flickering bands of lightning playing across the tops of the clouds. There was no getting away from it. Milo had been right. They were flying toward a storm. Jenna tapped Septimus on the shoulder. "Can we go around it?" she yelled. Septimus twisted around and looked behind, only to see a fork of lightning streak down, narrowly missing Spitfire's tail. It was too late. Suddenly the storm was around them. "I'll take him down. Fly near the water. Less windy," was all Jenna heard as the wind snatched Septimus's words out of his mouth. The next thing Beetle knew, Spitfire was dropping like a stone. Beetle was convinced that Spitfire had been struck by a lightning bolt. The snake lying in the pit of his stomach began to tie itself in knots. He screwed his eyes shut, and as the roar of the waves got louder, and the salt spray blew into his face, he waited for the inevitable splash. When it didn't come, Beetle risked opening his eyes, and wished he hadn't. A wall of water as high as a house was heading right for them. Septimus had seen it too. "Up! Up, Spitfire!" he yelled, giving the dragon 2 hefty kicks on the right. Spitfire didn't need to be told or kicked. He disliked walls of water as much as his passengers did. He shot up just in time, and the huge wave traveled on below, showering them with spray. Septimus took Spitfire up a little higher, so that the dragon was flying just out of reach of the spray, and peered down at the sea. He had never seen it like this. Deep troughs and rolling mountains of water, their tops blown off by the wind in horizontal streaks of spume. Septimus gulped. This was serious. "Keep going, Spitfire," he yelled. "Keep going. We'll be out of this soon." But they weren't out of it soon. Septimus had never before considered how large the storm might be. Storms were always something that passed overhead, but now he began to wonder how many miles wide the storm might actually be, and, more important, was it traveling with them or crossing their path? They lurched on. The wind howled, and the waves roared and crashed like marauding armies, throwing them to and fro in the midst of their battle. Violent gusts of wind snatched at Spitfire's wings, which Septimus was beginning to realize were somewhat flimsy, just thin dragon skin and a lightweight tracery of bones. Every time a squall caught Spitfire, they were thrown sideways or even worse, backward, which was much more difficult to recover from, and left Beetle gasping in terror. Septimus knew that Spitfire was getting tired. The dragon's neck drooped, and beneath his hands Spitfire's muscles felt knotted and weary. "On, Spitfire, on!" Septimus yelled over and over again until his voice was hoarse. They plunged forward through the wind and the driving rain, jumping at each roll of thunder, flinching with every crack of lightning. It was then that Septimus thought he saw the light of a lighthouse in the distance. He stared, just to make sure it was not another lightning flash, but the glow that lit up the horizon was no flash. It burned steady and bright. At last Septimus felt they had a chance. Remembering what Nico had told him about the passage home, he changed course and set Spitfire heading toward the light, into the teeth of the wind. At the back of the dragon, Beetle registered the change of course, and wondered why, until he caught a glimpse of the light ahead. Suddenly his spirits lifted. It must be the Double Dune light. Warm and happy thoughts of the welcoming port not far ahead flooded him, and he even began to hope that maybe, if they were lucky, the harbor and dock pie shop might still be open, and one of his cousins could be prevailed upon to give them all a bed for the night. As Beetle daydreamed about a warm, dry bed, and a harbor and dock pie, Septimus felt hopeful too, as he was sure the storm was abating. He flew Spitfire high once more, so that he could get a better view of where they were going. The light shone brilliantly into the night, and Septimus smiled. It was as he had hoped. There were two lights close together, just as Nico had described. Now he knew where they were. He flew steadily on until he was so close that he could even see the peculiar ear-like points at the very top of the lighthouse tower. But as he flew Spitfire up a little higher, before he made the course change, the storm had its last throw. From directly above, a great crack of lightning snaked down, and this time it scored a hit. Spitfire was sent reeling. An acrid smell of burning dragon flesh enveloped them as the dragon fell from the sky. They were sent plummeting toward the lighthouse, and as they fell, Beetle came back to reality. He realized that the light was not housed in the ramshackle metal frame of the Double Dune light, but was two lights atop a blackened brick tower, sporting 2 points that looked, Beetle thought in his terrified state, like cat ears. As they tumbled toward the sea, Beetle saw that there were no friendly lights of the port awaiting them, only blackness.